Once Rommel's force settled into the Cauldron, the battle at Gazala became less a story of sweeping armored movement and more a struggle to keep an exposed army alive. The panzers and Italian armor had moved around the southern flank and behind the British line, but that bold maneuver had created a dangerous supply problem. Minefields and British positions stood between the Axis pocket and easier routes back to the west. Inside the Cauldron, fuel, ammunition, water, and spare parts began to matter as much as tank tactics. The attacker had reached a position that threatened the British defense, but unless supply could pass through the minefields, that position could become a trap. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The minefields around Gazala were not just passive obstacles scattered across the desert. They were part of the British defensive design, intended to slow movement, channel attacks, and protect the boxes from sudden armored thrusts. For Rommel, once his armored columns were east of these belts, the mines became something more dangerous, a barrier between combat power and survival. A tank force can look formidable as long as its vehicles are moving and firing, but every gallon of fuel burned inside the pocket had to be replaced from somewhere. Every shell fired had to be hauled forward. Every wounded man and damaged vehicle deepened the need for reliable routes through the defensive system. This is why engineers became some of the most important soldiers in the battle. They were not simply supporting characters in a drama led by tanks. They were the men who had to find, mark, clear, widen, and protect corridors through ground designed to kill or stop vehicles. Clearing a route through mines under pressure required patience, courage, and technical skill, but the battle gave them little time and no quiet laboratory conditions. Shellfire, air attack, dust, darkness, and confusion all complicated the work. If engineers opened a lane, that lane could become a lifeline. If they failed, the Cauldron could begin to suffocate. The process of moving supplies through a minefield was never as simple as drawing an arrow on a map. A cleared path had to be known to the troops who needed it, marked well enough for drivers to follow, and protected from British fire and counterattack. Vehicles could not safely wander off the route, yet a convoy confined to a narrow track became vulnerable to artillery, aircraft, breakdowns, and traffic jams. One damaged truck could block movement for those behind it. One mistake in navigation could send vehicles into uncleared ground. The corridor itself became a battlefield, because whoever controlled it controlled whether Rommel's force remained dangerous. British commanders understood, at least in principle, how serious the Axis supply problem was. If the Eighth Army could keep the Cauldron sealed, Rommel's bold maneuver might collapse under its own weight. British artillery, air attacks, patrols, and armored pressure all had the potential to disrupt the flow of fuel and ammunition. The problem was that disruption had to be sustained and coordinated. A single successful attack on a convoy might hurt, but it would not necessarily decide the battle. To make the Cauldron truly untenable, the British had to prevent the Axis from turning temporary tracks into reliable supply arteries. Rommel's army fought this problem with urgency because there was no other choice. German and Italian formations inside the pocket needed enough supply to hold off British counterattacks and enough mobility to keep threatening the wider Gazala position. Anti-tank guns had to be moved and supplied with ammunition. Artillery needed shells. Tanks needed fuel, not only for attack, but also for repositioning, withdrawal, and local countermoves. Repair crews needed parts and tools to bring damaged vehicles back into action. A battle that appears from a distance to be about armored clashes was, at ground level, also about whether trucks could reach gun lines before the next British assault arrived. Air power added another layer of danger. Desert convoys were hard to hide, especially when traffic concentrated around known lanes through minefields. Aircraft could strike vehicles, dump areas, road junctions, and assembly points, turning supply movement into a hazardous operation, even away from the front line. Dust trails gave away movement, and vehicles moving in daylight could become targets before they reached the troops who needed them. Moving at night reduced some dangers, but created others, especially in a mined landscape where navigation errors could be fatal. Every method of supply carried risk, and every delay threatened to weaken the Axis pocket. The British had their own supply difficulties while trying to exploit Rommel's danger. Attacking the Cauldron required fuel, ammunition, recovery vehicles, artillery support, and coordination across a battlefield already strained by movement and confusion. British armored units that had taken losses needed repair and reorganization before they could strike effectively again. Infantry and artillery had to be brought into positions from which they could help reduce the pocket. Engineers had to manage friendly routes through their own minefields while preventing Axis use of cleared lanes. The Eighth Army was trying to starve Rommel's force while also feeding its own effort to destroy him, and that was not a simple task. This struggle over corridors explains why the Cauldron did not behave like a normal encirclement. In many battles, a surrounded force is gradually compressed until it runs out of room and supply. At Gazala, the distances, minefields, and mobility made the situation more fluid. The Axis were constrained, but not sealed in a perfect ring. The British threatened the pocket, but did not fully close every opening. Engineers and convoy drivers could change the balance by creating or maintaining usable routes. The question was not only whether Rommel was surrounded, it was whether he was surrounded tightly enough and long enough for his strength to fail. Inside this contest, supply troops carried a burden that rarely receives the attention given to tank crews. Drivers had to move forward knowing that the route might be shelled, bombed, blocked, or incorrectly marked. Mechanics had to repair vehicles under conditions that would challenge any workshop, often with limited tools and parts. Medical personnel had to move casualties through the same dangerous corridors that carried fuel and ammunition forward. Signals personnel had to keep units informed about routes, threats, and changing orders. The Cauldron survived not because tanks alone held it, but because a whole support system continued functioning under pressure. The opening of supply routes also changed the tactical meaning of British attacks. As long as Rommel's force seemed cut off, British commanders could believe time favored them. But every convoy that got through weakened that assumption. Every gun resupplied and every tank refueled made the Cauldron less vulnerable and more capable of punishing the next attack. This created a cruel reversal. The British were attacking a force they believed was in danger, yet the more the Axis stabilized its supply, the more those attacks ran into prepared defenses. What began as an opportunity to crush Rommel became a grinding contest in which British armor was repeatedly drawn toward well-organized fire. Bir Hakeim remained important because it threatened the southern flank of this supply problem. The Free French position interfered with easy movement around the lower end of the Gazala system and forced Axis attention away from the Cauldron itself. As long as Bir Hakeim held, Rommel could not treat the southern approach as secure. That meant the fight for supply through the minefields was tied to the wider struggle around the boxes. A single strongpoint could influence convoy routes, engineering priorities, and the timing of operations far beyond its immediate perimeter. The battle's logistics and tactics were not separate stories. They were one system under stress. Supply through the minefields matters because it reveals the real nature of Rommel's gamble at Gazala. His armored sweep had created shock, but shock had to be sustained by trucks, engineers, fuel cans, ammunition crates, recovery vehicles, and men working under fire. The Cauldron survived because Axis forces managed to turn narrow, dangerous routes into enough of a lifeline to keep fighting. The British saw the danger, but could not convert it into a decisive strangling of the pocket before Rommel stabilized his position. In the larger history of armored warfare, this phase teaches a lesson as important as any tank charge. Maneuver wins attention, but supply decides whether that maneuver becomes victory or disaster.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.